Light reveals to us beauty, but also ugliness. Throw vitriol in the face of a beautiful woman, and the beauty is gone. No power on earth will enable us to look upon her with the same rapture as before. Could even the sincerest, deepest love endure the change? True, the idealist will hasten to say that love overcomes all things. But idealism needs be prompt, for if she leaves us one single moment in which to see, we shall see such things as are not easily explained away. That is why idealists stick so tight to logic. In the twinkling of an eye, logic will convey us to the remotest conclusions and forecasts. Reality could never overtake her. Love is eternal, and consequently a disfigured face will seem as lovely to us as a fresh one. This is, of course, a lie, but it helps to preserve the old tastes and obscures danger. Real danger, however, was never dispelled by words. In spite of Schiller and eternal love, in the long run vitriol triumphs, and the agreeable young man is forced to abandon his beloved and acknowledge himself a fraud. Light, the source of his life and hope, has now destroyed hope and life for him. He will not return to idealism, and he will hate logic. Light, that seemed to him so beautiful, will have become hideous. He will turn to darkness, where logic and its binding conclusions have no power, but where the fancy is free for all her vagaries. Without light we should never have known that vitriol ruins beauty. No science, nor any art, can give us what darkness gives. It is true, in our young days when all was new, light brought us great happiness and joy. Let us therefore remember it with gratitude, as a benefactor we no longer need. Do, after all, let us dispense with gratitude, for it belongs to the calculating bourgeois virtues. Do ut des, let us forget light and gratitude, and the qualms of self-important idealism. Let us go bravely to meet the coming night. She promises us great power over reality. Is it worth while to give up our old tastes and lofty convictions? Love and light have not availed against vitriol. What a horror would have seized us at the thought, once upon a time. That short phrase can annul all Schiller. We have shut our eyes and stopped our ears. We have built huge philosophic systems to shield us from this tiny thought. And now it seems we have no more feeling for Schiller and the great systems. We have no pity on our past beliefs. We now are seeking for words with which to sing the praises of our former enemy. Night, the dark, deaf, impenetrable night, peopled with horrors, does she not now loom before us, infinitely beautiful? Does she not draw us with her still, mysterious, fathomless beauty, far more powerfully than noisy, narrow day? It seems as if in a short while man will feel that the same incomprehensible, cherishing power which threw us out into the universe and set us, like plants, to reach to the light, is now gradually transferring us to a new direction, where a new life awaits us with all its stores. Fata volentem ducunt, nolentem trahunt. And perhaps the time is near when the impassioned poet, casting a last look to his past, will boldly and gladly cry, "Hide thyself, sun! O darkness, be welcome!" 2. Psychology at last leads us to conclude that the most generous human impulses spring from a root of egoism. Tolstoy's love to one's neighbour, for example, proves to be a branch of the old self-love. The same may be said of Kant's idealism and even of Plato's. Though they glorify the service of the idea, in practice they succeed in getting out of the vicious circle of egoism no better than the ordinary mortal, who is neither a genius nor a flower of culture. In my eyes this is almost an absolute truth. It is never wrong to add the retractive almost. Truth is too much inclined to exaggerate its own importance, and one must guard oneself against its despotic authority. Thus all men are egoists. Hence follows a great deal. I even think this proposition might provide better grounds for metaphysical conclusions than the doubtful capacity for compassion and love for one's neighbour, which has been so tempting to dogma. For some reason men have imagined that love for oneself is more natural and comprehensible than love for another. Why? Love for others is only a little rarer, less widely diffused than love to oneself. But then hippopotami and rhinoceros, even in their own tropical regions, are less frequent than horses and mules. Does it follow that they are less natural and transcendental? Positivism is not incumbent upon bloodthirsty savages. Nay, as we know, many of them are less positive-minded than our learned men. For instance, a future life is to them such an infallible reality that they even enter into contracts, part of which is to be fulfilled in the next world. A German metaphysician won't go as far as that. Hence it follows that the way to know the other world is not by any means through love, sympathy, and self-denial, as Schopenhauer taught. On the contrary, it appears as if love for others were only an impediment to metaphysical flights. Love and sympathy chain the eye to the misery of this earth, where such a wide field for active charity opens out. The materialists were mostly very good men, a fact which bothered the historians of philosophy. They preached matter, believed in nothing, and were ready to perform all kinds of sacrifices for their neighbors. How is this? It is a case of clearest logical consequence. Man loves his neighbor, he sees that heaven is indifferent to misery, therefore he takes upon himself the role of providence. Were he indifferent to the sufferings of others, he would easily become an idealist and leave his neighbors to their fate. Love and compassion kill belief, and make a man a positivist and a materialist in his philosophical outlook. If he feels the misery of others, he leaves off meditating and wants to act. Man only thinks properly when he realizes he has nothing to do, his hands are tied. That is why any profound thought must arise from despair. Optimism, on the other hand, the readiness to jump hastily from one conclusion to another, may be regarded as an inevitable sign of narrow self-sufficiency, which dreads doubt and is consequently always superficial. If a man offers you a solution of eternal questions, it shows he has not even begun to think about them. He has only acted. Perhaps it is not necessary to think. Who can say how we ought or ought not to live? And how could we be brought to live as we ought, when our own nature is and always will be an incalculable mystery? There is no mistake about it. Nobody wants to think. I do not speak here of logical thinking. That, like any other natural function, gives man great pleasure. For this reason, philosophical systems, however complicated, arouse real and permanent interest in the public, provided they only require from man the logical exercise of the mind and nothing else. But to think, really to think, surely this means a relinquishing of logic. It means living a new life. It means a permanent sacrifice of the dearest habits, tastes, attachments, without even the assurance that the sacrifice will bring any compensation. Artists and philosophers like to imagine the thinker with a stern face, a profound look which penetrates into the unseen, and a noble bearing, an eagle preparing for flight. Not at all. A thinking man is one who has lost his balance, in the vulgar, not in the tragic sense. Hands raking the air, feet flying, face scared and bewildered, he is a caricature of helplessness and pitiable perplexity. Look at the aged Turgenev, his poems and prose, and his letter to Tolstoy. Maupassant thus tells of his meeting with Turgenev: "There entered a giant with a silvery head." Quite so. The majestic patriarch and master, of course. The myth of giants with silver locks is firmly established in the heart of man. Then suddenly enters Turgenev in his prose poems, pale, pitiful, fluttering like a bird that has been winged. Turgenev, who has taught us everything, how can he be so fluttered and bewildered? How could he write his letter to Tolstoy? Did he not know that Tolstoy was finished, the source of his creative activity dried up, that he must seek other activities? Of course he knew. And still he wrote that letter. But it was not for Tolstoy, nor even for Russian literature, which, of course, is not kept going by the deathbed letters and covenants of its giants. In the dreadful moments of the end, Turgenev, in spite of his noble size and silver locks, did not know what to say or where to look for support and consolation. So he turned to literature, to which he had given his life. He yearned that she, whom he had served so long and loyally, should just once help him, Save him from the horrible and thrice senseless nightmare. He stretched out his withered, numbing hands to the printed sheets which still preserve the traces of the soul of living, suffering man. He addressed his late enemy Tolstoy with the most flattering name: "Great writer of the Russian land," recollected that he was his contemporary, that he himself was a great writer of the Russian land. But this he did not express aloud. He only said, "I can no longer." He praised a strict school of literary and general education. To the last he tried to preserve his bearing of a giant with silvery locks, and we were gratified. The same persons who are indignant at Gogol's correspondence quote Turgenev's letter with reverence. The attitude is everything. Turgenev knew how to pose passably well, and this is ascribed to him as his greatest merit. Mundus vult decipi, ergo decipiatur. But Gogol and Turgenev felt substantially the same. Had Turgenev burnt his own manuscripts and talked of himself instead of Tolstoy before death, he would have been accounted mad. Moralists would have reproached him for his display of extreme egoism. And philosophy? Philosophy seems to be getting rid of certain prejudices. At the moment when men are least likely to play the hypocrite and lie to themselves, Turgenev and Gogol place their personal fate higher than the destinies of Russian literature. Does not this betray a secret to us? Ought we not to see in absolute egoism an inalienable and great, yes, very great quality of human nature? Psychology, ignoring the threats of morality, has led us to a new knowledge. Yet still, in spite of the instances we have given, the mass of people will, as usual, see nothing but malice in every attempt to reveal the human impulses that underlie lofty motives. To be merely men seems humiliating to men. So now malice will also be detected in my interpretation of Turgenev's letter, no matter what assurance I offer to the contrary. 3. On method. A certain naturalist made the following experiment. A glass jar was divided into two halves by a perfectly transparent glass partition. On the one side of the partition he placed a pike, on the other a number of small fishes, such as formed the prey of the pike. The pike did not notice the partition, and hurled itself on its prey, with, of course, the result only of a bruised nose. The same happened many times, and always the same result. At last, seeing all its efforts ended so painfully, the pike abandoned the hunt, so that in a few days, when the partition had been removed, it continued to swim about among the small fry without daring to attack them. Does not the same happen with us? Perhaps the limits between this world and the other world are also essentially of an experimental origin, neither rooted in the nature of things, as was thought before Kant, or in the nature of our reason, as was thought after Kant. Perhaps, indeed, a partition does exist, and make vain all attempts to cross over. But perhaps there comes a moment when the partition is removed. In our minds, however, the conviction is firmly rooted that it is impossible to pass certain limits, and painful to try, a conviction founded on experience. But in this case we should recall the old scepticism of Hume, which idealist philosophy has regarded as mere subtle mind play, valueless after Kant's critique. The most lasting and varied experience cannot lead to any binding and universal conclusion. Nay, all our a priori, which are so useful for a certain time, become sooner or later extremely harmful. A philosopher should not be afraid of scepticism, but should go on bruising his jaw. Perhaps the failure of metaphysics lies in the caution and timidity of metaphysicians, who seem ostensibly so brave. They have sought for rest, which they describe as the highest boon. Whereas they should have valued more than anything restlessness, aimlessness, even purposelessness. How can you tell when the partition will be removed? Perhaps at the very moment when man ceased his painful pursuit, settled all his questions, and rested on his laurels inert, he could with one strong push have swept through the pernicious fence which separated him from the unknowable. There is no need for man to move according to a carefully considered plan. This is a purely aesthetic demand which need not bind us. Let man senselessly and deliriously knock his head against the wall. If the wall go down at last, will he value his triumph any the less? Unfortunately for us, the illusion has been established in us that plan and purpose are the best guarantee of success. What a delusion it is! The opposite is true. The best of all that genius has revealed to us has been revealed as the result of fantastic, erratic, apparently ridiculous and useless, but relentlessly stubborn seeking. Columbus, tired of sitting on the same spot, sailed west to look for India. And genius, in spite of vulgar conception, is a condition of chaos and unutterable restlessness. Not for nothing has genius been counted kin to madness. Genius flings itself hither and thither because it has not the Sitzfleisch necessary for industrious success in mediocrity. We may be sure that earth has seen much more genius than history has recorded, since genius is acknowledged only when it has been serviceable. When the tossing about has led to no useful issue, which is the case in the majority of instances, it arouses only a feeling of disgust and abomination in all witnesses. He can't rest, and he can't let others rest. If Lermontov and Dostoevsky had lived in times when there was no demand for books, nobody would have noticed them. Lermontov's early death would have passed unregretted. Perhaps some settled and virtuous citizen would have remarked, weary of the young man's eternal and dangerous freaks, for a dog's death. The same of Gogol, Tolstoy, Pushkin. Now they are praised because they left interesting books. And so we need pay no attention to the cry about the futility and worthlessness of skepticism, even skepticism pure and unadulterated, skepticism which has no ulterior motive of clearing the way for a new creed. To knock one's head against the wall out of hatred for the wall, to beat against established and obstructive ideas because one detests them, is it not an attractive proposition? And then, to see ahead uncertainly and limitless possibilities, instead of up-to-date ideals, is not this too fascinating? The highest good is rest. I shall not argue. De gustibus aut nihil aut bene. By the way, isn't it a superb principle? And this superb principle has been arrived at perfectly by chance. Unfortunately not by me, but by one of the comical characters in Tchekhov's Seagull. He mixed up two Latin proverbs, and the result was a splendid maxim, which, in order to become an a priori, awaits only universal acceptance. Metaphysicians praise the transcendental and carefully avoid it. Nietzsche hated metaphysics, he praised the earth, bleibt nur der Erde treu, o meine Brüder, and always lived in the realm of the transcendental. Of course the metaphysicians behave better, this is indisputable. He who would be a teacher must proclaim the metaphysical point of view, and he may become a hero without ever smelling powder. In these anxious days when positivism seems to fall short, one cannot do better than turn to metaphysics. Then the young man need not any more envy Alexander the Macedonian. With the assistance of a few books, not only earthly states are conquered, but the whole mysterious universe. Metaphysics is the great art of swerving round dangerous experience. So metaphysicians should be called the positivists par excellence. They do not despise all experience, as they assert, but only the dangerous experiences. They adapt the safest of all methods of self-defense, what the English call protective mimicry. Let us repeat to all students, professors know it already, he who would be a sincere metaphysician must avoid risky experience. Schiller once asked, how can tragedy give delight? The answer, to put it in our own words, was, if we are to obtain delight from tragedy, it must be seen only upon the stage. In order to love the transcendental, it also should be known only from the stage, or from books of the philosophers. This is called idealism, the nicest word ever invented by philosophizing men. 5. Poetae nascuntur. Wonderful is man. Knowing nothing about it, he asserts the existence of an objective impossibility. Even a little while ago, before the invention of the telephone and telegraph, men would have declared it impossible for Europe to converse with America. Now it is possible. We cannot produce poets, therefore we say they are born. Certainly we cannot make a child a poet by forcing him to study literary models, from the most ancient to the most modern. Neither will anybody hear us in America, no matter how loud we shout here. To make a poet of a man he must not be developed along ordinary lines. Perhaps books should be kept from him. Perhaps it is necessary to perform some apparently dangerous operation on him, fracture his skull or throw him out of a fourth-storey window. I will refrain from recommending these methods as a substitute for pedagogy. But that is not the point. Look at the great men and the poets. Except John Stuart Mill and a couple of other positivist thinkers who had learned fathers and virtuous mothers, none of the great men can boast of, or better, complain of, a proper upbringing. In their lives nearly always the decisive part was played by accident, accident which reason would dub meaninglessness, if reason ever dared raise its voice against obvious success. Something like a broken skull or a fall from the fourth floor, not metaphorically but often absolutely literally, has proved the commencement, usually concealed but occasionally avowed, of the activity of genius. But we repeat automatically, poetae nascuntur, and are deeply convinced that this extraordinary truth is so lofty it needs no verification. 6. Until Apollo calls him to the sacrifice, ignobly the poet is plunged in the cares of this shoddy world. Silent is his lyre, cold sleeps his soul. Of all the petty children of earth, most petty, it seems, is he. Pissariev, the critic, was exasperated by these verses. Presumably, if they had not belonged to Pouschkine, all the critics along with Pissariev would have condemned them and their author to oblivion. Suspicious verse! Before Apollo calls to him, the poet is the most insignificant of mortals. In his free hours the ordinary man finds some more or less distinguished distraction for himself. He hunts, attends exhibitions of pictures or the theatre, and finally rests in the bosom of his family. But the poet is incapable of normal existence. Immediately he has finished with Apollo, forgetting all about altars and sacrifices, he proceeds to occupy himself with unworthy objects. Or he abandons himself to the dolce far niente, the customary pastime of all favourites of the Muses. Let us here remark that not only all poets, but all writers and artists in general, are inclined to lead bad lives. Think what Tolstoy tells us in Confession and elsewhere of the best representatives of literature in the 50s. On the whole, it is just as Pouschkine says in his verses. Whilst he is engaged in composition, an author is a creature of some consequence. Apart from this, he is nothing. Why are Apollo and the Muses so remiss? Why do they draw to themselves wayward or vicious votaries, instead of rewarding virtue? We dare not suspect the gods, even the dethroned, of bad intentions. Apollo loved virtuous persons, and yet virtuous persons are evidently mediocre and unfit for the sacred offices. If any man is overcome with a great desire to serve the god of song, let him get rid of his virtues at once. Curious that this truth is so completely unknown to men. They think that through virtue they can truly deserve the favour and choice of Apollo. And since industry is the first virtue, they peg away morning, noon, and night. Of course, the more they work, the less they do. Which really puzzles and annoys them. They even fling aside the sacred arts and all the labours of a devotee. They give themselves up to idleness and other bad habits. And sometimes it so happens that just as a man decides that it is all no good, the Muses suddenly visit him. So it was with Dostoevsky and others. Schiller alone managed to get round Apollo. But perhaps it was only his biographers he got round. Germans are so trustful, so easy to deceive. The biographers saw nothing unusual in Schiller's habit of keeping his feet in cold water whilst he worked. No doubt they felt that if the divine poet had lived in the Sahara, where water is precious as gold, and the inspired cannot take a foot bath every day, then the speeches of the Marquis of Pola would have lacked half their nobleness at least. And apparently Schiller was not so wonderfully chaste, if he needed such artificial resources in the composition of his fine speeches. In a word, we must believe Pouschkine. A poet is, on the one hand, among the elect; on the other hand, he is one of the most insignificant of mortals. Hence we can draw a very consoling conclusion. The most insignificant of men are not altogether so worthless as we imagine. They may not be fit to occupy government positions or professorial chairs, but they are often extremely at home on Parnassus and such high places. Apollo rewards vice, and virtue, as everybody knows, is so satisfied with herself she needs no reward. Then why do the pessimists lament? Leibniz was quite right. We live in the best possible of worlds. I would even suggest that we leave out the modification possible. 7. It is das ewig Weibliche with Russian writers. Pushkin and Lermontov loved women and were not afraid of them. Who trusted his own nature was often in love, and always sang his love of the moment. When infatuated with a bacchante, he glorified bacchantes. When he married, he warbled of a modest, nun-like beauty, his wife. A synthesizing mind would probably not know what to do with all Pushkin's sorts of love. Nor is Lermontov any better. He abused women, but as Byelinsky observed after meeting him, he loved women more than anything in the world. And again, not women of one mould only, any and all attractive females. The wild Bella, the lovely Mary, Tamar, one and all, no matter of what race or condition. Every time Lermontov is in love, he assures us his love is so deep and ardent and even moral that we cannot judge him without compunction. Vladimir Soloviov alone was not afraid to condemn him. He brought Pushkin as well as Lermontov to account for their moral irregularities, and he even went so far as to say that it was not he himself who judged them, but fate, in whose service he acted as public denouncer. Lermontov and Pushkin, both dying young, had deserved death for their frivolities. But there was nobody else besides Vladimir Soloviov to darken the memories of the two poets. It is true Tolstoy cannot forgive Pushkin's dissolute life, but he does not apply to fate for a verdict. According to Tolstoy, morality can cope even with a titan like Pushkin. In Tolstoy's view, morality grows stronger the harder the job it has to tackle. It pardons the weak offenders without waste of words, but it never forgives pride and self-confidence. If Tolstoy's edicts had been executed, all memorials to Pushkin would have disappeared, chiefly because of the poet's addiction to the eternal female. In such a case Tolstoy is implacable. He admits the kind of love whose object is the establishing of a family, but no more. Don Juan is a hateful transgressor. Think of Levin and his attitude to prostitutes. He is exasperated, indignant, even forgets the need for compassion and calls them beasts. In the eternal female, Tolstoy sees temptation, seduction, sin, great danger. Therefore it is necessary to keep quite away from the danger. But surely danger is the dragon which guards every treasure on earth. And again, no matter what his precautions, a man will meet his fate sooner or later and come into conflict with the dragon. Surely this is an axiom. Pushkin and Lermontov loved danger, and therefore sought women. They paid a heavy price, but while they lived freely and lightly. If they had cared to peep in the book of destinies, they might have averted or avoided their sad end. But they preferred to trust their star, lucky or unlucky. Tolstoy was the first among us — we cannot speak of Gogol — who began to fear life. He was the first to start open moralizing. In so far as public opinion and personal dignity demand it, he did go to meet his dangers, but not a step further. So he avoided women, art, and philosophy. Love per se, that is, love which does not lead to a family, like wisdom per se, which is wisdom that has no utilitarian motive, and like art for art's sake, seemed to him the worst of temptations, leading to the destruction of the soul. When he plunged too deep in thinking, he was seized with panic. It seemed to me I was going mad, so I went away to the Bashkirs for kumiss. Such confessions are common in his works. And surely there is no other way with temptations than to cut short at once before it is too late. Tolstoy preserved himself on account of his inborn instinct for departing betimes from a dangerous situation. Save for this cautious prompting, he would probably have ended like Lermontov or Pushkin. True, he might have gone deeper into nature and revealed us rare secrets, instead of preaching at us abstinence, humility, simplicity, and so on. But such luck fell to the fate of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had very muddled relations with morality. He was too racked by disease and circumstance to get much profit out of the rules of morality. The hygiene of the soul, like that of the body, is beneficial only to healthy men. To the sick it is simply harmful. The more Dostoevsky engaged himself with high morality, the more inextricably entangled he became. He wanted to respect the personality in a woman, and only the personality, and so he came to the point where he could not look on any woman, however ugly, with indifference. The elder Karamazov, and his affair with Elizabeth Smerdyascha, Stinking Lizzie, in what other imagination could such a union have been contemplated? Dostoevsky, of course, reprimands Karamazov, and thanks to the standards of modern criticism, such a reprimand is accounted sufficient to exonerate our author. But there are other standards. If a writer sets out to tell you that no drab could be so loathsome that her ugliness would make you forget she was a woman, and if, for illustration of this novel idea, we are told the history of Fyodor Karamazov with the deformed, repulsive idiot, Stinking Lizzie, then, in face of such imaginative art, it is surely out of place to preserve the usual confidence in that writer. We do not speak of the interest and appreciation of Dostoevsky's tastes and ideas. Not for one moment will I assert that those who with Pushkin and Lermontov can see the eternal female only in young and charming women have any advantage over Dostoevsky. Of course we are not forbidden to live according to our tastes, and we may, like Tolstoy, call certain women beasts. But who has given us the right to assert that we are higher or better than Dostoevsky? Judging objectively, all the points go to show that Dostoevsky is better. At any rate, he saw further, deeper. He could find an original interest. He could discover das ewig Weibliche where we should see nothing of attraction at all, where Goethe would avert his face. Stinking Lizzie is not a beast, as Levine would say, but a woman who is able, if even for a moment, to arouse a feeling of love in a man. And we thought she was worse than nothing, since she roused in us only disgust. Dostoevsky made a discovery, we with our refined feelings missed it. His distorted, abnormal sense showed a greater sensitiveness in which our high morality was deficient. And the road to the great truth this time, as ever, is through deformity. Idealists will not agree. They are quite justly afraid that one may not reach the truth, but may get stuck in the mud. Idealists are careful men, and not nearly so stupid as their ideals would lead us to suppose. 8. New ideas, even our own, do not quickly conquer our sympathies. We must first get accustomed to them. 9. A point of view. Every writer, thinker, even every educated person thinks it necessary to have a permanent point of view. He climbs up some elevation and never climbs down again all his days. Whatever he sees from this point of view, he believes to be reality, truth, justice, good, and what he does not see, he excludes from existence. Man is not much to blame for this. Surely there is no very great joy in moving from point of view to point of view, shifting one's camp from peak to peak. We have no wings, and a winged thought is only a nice metaphor, unless, of course, it refers to logical thinking. There, to be sure, great volatility is usual, a lightness which comes from perfect naivete, if not ignorance. He who really wishes to know something, and not merely to have a philosophy, does not rely on logic and is not allured by reason. He must clamber from summit to summit, and, if necessary, hibernate in the dales. For a wide horizon leads to illusions, and in order to familiarize oneself with any object, it is essential to go close up to it, touch it, feel it, examine it from top to bottom, and on every side. One must be ready, should this be impossible otherwise, to sacrifice the customary position of the body, to wriggle, to lie flat, to stand on one's head, in a word, to assume the most unnatural of attitudes. Can there be any question of a permanent point of view? The more mobility and elasticity a man has, the less he values the ordinary equilibrium of his body. The oftener he changes his outlook, the more he will take in. If, on the other hand, he imagines that from this or the other pinnacle he has the most comfortable survey of the world and life, leave him alone. He will never know anything. Nay, he does not want to know. He cares more about his personal convenience than about the quality of his work. No doubt he will attain to fame and success, and thus brilliantly justify his point of view. 10. Fame. A thread from every one, and the naked will have a shirt. There is no beggar but has his thread of cotton, and he will not grudge it to a naked man, no, nor even to a fully dressed one, but will bestow it on the first comer. The poor, who want to forget their poverty, are very ready with their threads. Moreover, they prefer to give them to the rich rather than to a fellow tramp. To load the rich with benefits, must not one be very rich indeed? That is why fame is so easily got. An ambitious person asks admiration and respect from the crowd, and is rarely denied. The mob feel that their throats are their own, and their arms are strong. Why not vociferate and clap, seeing that you can turn the head not only of a beggar like yourself, but of a future hero, God knows how almighty a person. The humiliated citizen who has hitherto been hauled off to the police station if he shouted, suddenly feels that his throat has acquired a new value. Never before has anyone given a rap for his worthless opinion, and now 7 cities are ready to quarrel for it, as for the right to claim Homer. The citizen is delighted. He shouts at the top of his voice, and is ready to throw all his possessions after his shouts. So the hero is satisfied. The greater the shout, the deeper his belief in himself and his mission. What will a hero not believe? For he forgets so soon the elements of which his fame and riches are made. Heroes usually are convinced that they set out on their noble career not to beg shouts from beggars, but to heap blessings on mankind. If they could only call to mind with what beating hearts they awaited their first applause, their first alms, how timidly they curried favour with ragged beggars, perhaps they would speak less assuredly of their own merits. But our memory is fully acquainted with Herbert Spencer and his law of adaptability. And thus many a worthy man goes gaily on in full belief in his own stupendous virtue. 11. In defense of righteousness. Inexperienced and ingenuous people see in righteousness merely a burden which lofty people have assumed out of respect for law, or for some other high and inexplicable reason. But a righteous man has not only duties but rights. True, sometimes, when the law is against him, he has to compromise. Yet how rarely does the law desert him! No cruelty matters in him so long as he does not infringe the statutes. Nay, he will ascribe his cruelty as a merit to himself, since he acts out of no personal considerations, but in the name of sacred justice. No matter what he may do, once he is sanctioned, he sees in his actions only merit, merit, merit. Modesty forbids him to say too much, but if he were to let go, what a luxurious panegyric he might deliver to himself. Remembering his works, he praises himself at all times, not aloud, but inwardly. The nature of virtue demands it. Man must rejoice in his morality and ever keep it in mind. And after that, people declare that it is hard to be righteous. Whatever the other virtues may be, certainly righteousness has its selfish side. As a rule, it is decidedly worth while to make considerable sacrifices in order later on to enjoy in calm confidence all that surety and those rights bestowed on a man by morality and public approval. Look at a German who has paid his contribution to a society for the assistance of the indigent. Not one stray farthing will he give, not to a poor wretch who is starving before his eyes, and in this he feels right. This is righteousness out and out. Pay your tax and enjoy the privileges of a high-principled man. So righteousness is much in vogue with cultured commercial nations. Russians have not quite got there. They are afraid of the exactions of righteousness, not guessing the enormous advantages derived. A Russian has a permanent relationship with his conscience, which costs him far more than the most moral German or even Englishman has to pay for his righteousness. 12. The best way of getting rid of tedious, played-out truths is to stop paying them the tribute of respect, and to treat them with a touch of easy familiarity and derision. To put into brackets, as Dostoevsky did, such words as good, self-sacrifice, progress, and so on, will alone achieve you much more than many brilliant arguments would do. Whilst you still contest a certain truth, you still believe in it. And this even the least penetrating individual will perceive. But if you favour it with no serious attention, and only throw out a scornful remark now and then, the result is different. It is evident you have ceased to be afraid of the old truth, you no longer respect it. And this sets people thinking. 13. Four walls. Armchair philosophy is being condemned rightly. An armchair thinker is busy deciding on everything that is taking place in the world: the state of the world market, the existence of a world soul, wireless telegraphy, and the life after death, the cave dweller and the perfectibility of man, and so on and so on. His chief business is so to select his statements that there shall be no internal contradiction, and this will give an appearance of truth. Such work, which is quite amusing and even interesting, leads at last to very poor results. Surely, verisimilitudes of truth are not truth, nor have necessarily anything in common with truth. Again, a man who undertakes to talk of everything probably knows nothing. Thus a swan can fly and walk and swim, but it flies indifferently, walks badly, and swims poorly. An armchair philosopher enclosed by four walls sees nothing but those four walls, and yet of these precisely he does not choose to speak. If by accident he suddenly realized them and spoke of them, his philosophy might acquire an enormous value. This may happen when a study is converted into a prison, the same four walls, but impossible not to think of them. Whatever the prisoner turns his mind to, Homer, the Greek-Persian wars, the future world peace, the bygone geological cataclysms, still the four walls enclose it all. The calm of the study supplanted by the pathos of imprisonment. The prisoner has no more contact with the world, and no less, but now he no longer slumbers, and has greyish dreams called world conceptions. He is wide awake and strenuously living. His philosophy is worth hearing. But man is not distinguished for his powers of discrimination. He sees solitude in four walls and says, a study. He dreams of the marketplace, where there is noise and jostling, physical bustle, and decides that there alone life is to be met. He is wrong as usual. In the marketplace, among the crowd, do not men sleep their deadest sleep? And is not the keenest spiritual activity taking place in seclusion? 14. The Spartans made their helots drunk as an example and warning to their noble youths. A good method, no doubt, but what are we of the 20th century to do? Whom shall we make drunk? We have no slaves, so we have instituted a higher literature. Novels and stories describe drunken, dissolute men, and paint them in such horrid colours that every reader feels all his desire for vice depart from him. Unfortunately, only our Russians are either too conscientious or not sufficiently rectilinear in their minds. Instead of showing the drunken helot as an object of repugnance, as the Spartans did, they try to describe vice truthfully. Realism has taken hold. Indeed, why make a fuss? What does it matter if the writer's description is a little more or less ugly than the event? Was justice invented that everything, even evil, should be kept intact? Surely evil must be simply rooted out, banned, placed outside the pale. The Spartans did not stand on ceremony with living men, and yet our novelists are afraid of being unjust to imaginary drunken helots. And, so to speak, out of humane feeling too. How naive one must be to accept such a justification! Yet everybody accepts it. Tolstoy alone, towards the end, guessed that humanitarianism is only a pretext in this case, and that we Russians have described vice not only for the purpose of scaring our readers. In modern masters the word vice arouses not disgust, but insatiable curiosity. Perhaps the wicked thing has been persecuted in vain, like so many other good things. Perhaps it should have been studied. Perhaps it held mysteries. On the strength of this perhaps, morality was gradually abandoned, and Tolstoy remained almost alone in his indignation. Realism reigns, and a drunken helot arouses envy in timid readers who do not know where to put their trust, whether in the traditional rules or in the appeal of the master. A drunken helot an ideal? What have we come to? Were it not better to have stuck to Lycurgus? Have we not paid too dearly for our progress? Many people think we have paid too dearly. Not to mention Tolstoy, who is now no longer taken quite seriously, though still accounted a great man. Any mediocre journalist enjoys greater influence than this master writer of the Russian land. It is inevitable. Tolstoy insists on thinking about things which are nobody's concern. He has long since abandoned this world, and does he continue to exist in any other? A difficult question. Tolstoy writes books and letters, therefore he exists. This inference, once so convincing, now has hardly any effect on us, particularly if we take into account what it is that Tolstoy writes. In several of his last letters he expresses opinions which surely have no meaning for an ordinary man. They can be summed up in a few words. Tolstoy professes an extreme egoism, solipsism, soluipsism. That is, in his old age, after infinite attempts to love his neighbour, he comes to the conclusion that not only is it impossible to love one's neighbour, but that there is no neighbour, that in all the world Tolstoy alone exists, that there is even no world but only Tolstoy, a view so obviously absurd that it is not worth refuting. By the way, there is also no possibility of refuting it, unless you admit that logical inferences are non-binding. Solipsism dogged Tolstoy already in early youth, but at that time he did not know what to do with the impertinent, oppressive idea, so he ignored it. Finally he came to it. The older a man becomes, the more he learns how to make use of impertinent ideas. Fairly recently Tolstoy could pronounce such a dictum: Christ taught men not to do stupid things. Who but Tolstoy could have ventured on such an interpretation of the Gospels? Why have we all held, all of us but Tolstoy, that these words contain the greatest blasphemy on Christ and his teaching? But it was Tolstoy's last desperate attempt to save himself from solipsism, without at the same time flying in the face of logic. Even Christ appeared among men only to teach them common sense. Whence follows that mad thoughts may be rejected with an easy conscience, and the advantage, as usual, remains with the wholesome, reasonable, sensible thoughts. There is room for good and for reason. Good is self-understood, it need not be explained. If only good existed in the world, there would exist no questions, neither simple nor ultimate. This is why youth never questions. What indeed should it question? The song of the nightingale? The morning of May? Happy laughter? All the predicates of youth? Do these need interpretation? On the contrary, any explanation is reduced to these. The proper questions arise only on contact with evil. A hawk struck a nightingale, flowers withered, Boreas froze laughing youth, and in terror our questions arose. That is evil. The ancients were right. Not in vain is our earth called a vale of tears and sorrow. And once questions are started, it is impossible and unseemly to hurry the answers, still less anticipate the questions. The nightingale is dead and will sing no longer. The listener is frozen to death and can hear no more songs. The situation is so palpably absurd that only with the intention of getting rid of the question at any cost will one strive for a sensible answer. The answer must be absurd. If you don't want it, don't question. But if you must question, then be ready beforehand to reconcile yourself with something like solipsism or modern realism. Thought is in a dilemma, and dare not take the leap to get out. We laugh at philosophy, and as long as possible avoid evil. But nearly all men feel the intolerable cramp of such a situation, and each at his risk ventures to swim to shore on some more or less witty theory. A few courageous ones speak the truth, but they are neither understood nor respected. When a man's words show the depth of the pain through which he has passed, he is not indeed condemned, but the world begins to talk of his tragic state of soul, and to take on a mournful look fitting to the occasion. Others more scrupulous feel that phrases and mournful looks are unfitting, yet they cannot dwell at length on the tragedies of outsiders, so they take on an exaggeratedly stern bearing, as if to say, "We feel deeply, but we do not wish to show our feeling." They really feel nothing, only want to make others believe how sensitive and modest they are. At times this leads to curious results, even in writers of the first order of renown. Thus, Anatole France, the inventor of that most charming smile, which is intended to convince men that he feels everything and understands everything, but does not cry out, because that would not be fitting, in one of his novels takes upon himself the noble role of advocate of the victims of a crime, against the criminal. Our time, he says, out of pity to the criminal, forgets the sufferings of his victim. This, I repeat, is one of the most curious misrepresentations of modern endeavour. It is true we in Russia talk a good deal about compassion, particularly to criminals. And Anatole France is by no means the only man who thinks that our distinguishing characteristic is extreme sensitiveness and tender heartedness. But as a matter of fact, the modern man who thinks for himself is not drawn to the criminal by a sense of compassion, which would incontestably be better applied to the victim, but by curiosity or, if you like, inquisitiveness. For thousands of years man has sought to solve the great mystery of life through a God conception, with theodicy and metaphysical theories as a result, both of which deny the possibility of a mystery. Theodicy has long ago wearied us. The mechanistic theories which contend that there is nothing special in life, that its appearance and disappearance depend on the same laws as those of the conservation of energy and the indestructibility of matter, these look more plausible at first sight, but people do not take to them. And no theory can survive men's reluctance to believe in it. In a word, good has not justified the expectations placed on it. Reason has done no better. So overwrought mankind has turned from its old idols and enthroned madness and evil. The smiling Anatole argues and proves excellently. But who does not know what his proofs amount to? And who wants them? It may be our children will take fright at the task we have undertaken, will call us squandering parents, and will set themselves again to heaping up treasures, spiritual and material. Again they will believe in ideals, progress, and such like. For my own part, I have hardly any doubt of it. Solipsism and the cult of groundlessness are not lasting, and most of all, they are not to be handed down. The final triumph, in life as in old comedies, rests with goodness and common sense. History has known many epochs like ours, and gone through with them. Degeneration follows on the heels of immoderate curiosity, and sweeps away all refined and exaggeratedly well-informed individuals. Men of genius have no posterity, or their children are idiots. Not for nothing is nature so majestically serene; she has hidden her secrets well enough. Which is not surprising, considering how unscrupulous she is. No despot, not the greatest villain on earth has ever wielded power with the cruelty and heartlessness of nature. The least violation of her laws, and the severest punishment follows: disease, deformity, madness, death. What has not our common mother contrived to keep us in subjection? True, certain optimists think that nature does not punish us, but educates us. So Tolstoy sees it. Death and sufferings, like animated scarecrows, boo at man and drive him into the one way of life open to him, for life is subject to its own law of reason. Not a bad method of upbringing. Exactly like using wolves and bears. Unfortunate man, bolting from one booing monster, is not always able in time to dodge into the one correct way, and dashes straight into the maw of another beast of prey. Then what? And this often happens. Without disparagement of the optimists, we may say that sooner or later it happens to every man. After which no more running. You won't tear yourself out of the claws of madness or disease. Only one thing is left. In spite of traditions, theodicy, wiseacres, and most of all in spite of oneself, to go on praising Mother Nature and her great goodness. Let future generations reject us, let history stigmatize our names as the name of traitors to the human cause, still we will compose hymns to deformity, destruction, madness, chaos, darkness, and after that let the grass grow. Part 2, section 15. Astrology and alchemy lived their day and died a natural death, but they left a posterity, chemistry inventing dyes, and astronomy accumulating formulae. So it is. Geniuses beget idiots, especially when the mothers are very virtuous, as in this case, when their virtue is extraordinary. For the mothers are public utility and morality. The alchemists wasted their time seeking the philosopher's stone, the astrologers swindled people telling fortunes by the stars. Wedded to utility, these two fathers have begotten the chemists and astronomers. Nobody will dispute the genealogy. Perhaps even none will dispute that from idiotic children one may, with a measure of probability, infer genius in the parents. There are certain indications that this is so, though of course one may not go beyond supposition. But supposition is enough. There are more arguments in store. For instance, our day is so convinced of the absolute nonsense and uselessness of alchemy and astrology that no one dreams of verifying the conviction. We know there were many charlatans and liars amongst alchemists and astrologers. But what does this prove? In every department there are the same mediocre creatures who speculate on human credulity. However positive our science of medicine is, there are many fraudulent doctors who rob their patients. The alchemists and astrologers were, in all probability, the most remarkable men of their time. I will go further. In spite of dye-stuffs and formulae, even in our 19th century, which was so famous for its inventions and discoveries, the most eminent, talented men still sought the philosopher's stone and forecast the destinies of man. And those among them who were possessed of a poetic gift won universal attention. In the old days, consensu sapientium, a poet was allowed all kinds of liberties. He might speak of fate, miracles, spirits, the life beyond, indeed of anything, provided he was interesting. That was enough. The 19th century paid its tribute to restlessness. Never were there so many disturbing, throbbing writers as during the epoch of telephones and telegraphs. It was held indecent to speak, in plain language, of the vexed and troubled aspirations of the human spirit. Those guilty of the indecency were even dosed with bromides, and treated with shower baths and concentrated foods. But all this is external. It belongs to a history of fashions, and cannot interest us here. The point is that alchemy and astrology did not die, they only shammed death and left the stage for a time. Now, apparently, they are tired of seclusion, and are coming forward again, having pushed their unsuccessful children into the background. Well, so be it. À la bonne heure. 16. Man comes to the pass where all experience seems exhausted. Wherever he go, whatever he see, all is old and wearyingly familiar. Most people explain this by saying that they really know everything, and that from what they have experienced they can infer all experience. This phase of the exhaustion of life usually comes to a man between 35 and 40, the best period according to Karamzin. Not seeing anything new, the individual assumes he is completely matured and has the right to judge of everything. Knowing what has been, he can forecast what will be. But Karamzin was mistaken about the best period, and the mature people are mistaken about the nothing new can happen. The fact of spiritual stagnation should not be made the ground for judging all life's possibilities from known possibilities. On the contrary, such stagnation should prove that, however rich and multifarious the past may have been, it has not exhausted a tittle of the whole possibilities. From that which has been, it is impossible to infer what will be. Moreover, it is unnecessary, except, perhaps, to give us a sense of our full maturity, and let us enjoy all the charms of the best period of life, so eloquently described by Karamzin. The temptation is not overwhelming, so that if man is under the necessity of enduring a period of arrest and stagnation, and until such time as life restarts, is doomed to meditation, would it not be better to use this meditating interregnum for a directly opposite purpose from the one indicated, that is to say, for the purpose of finding in our past signs which tell us that the future has every right to be anything whatsoever like or utterly unlike the past. Such signs, given a good will to find them, may be seen in plenty. At times one comes to the conclusion that the natural connection of phenomena, as hitherto observed, is not at all inevitable for the future, and that miracles which so far have seemed impossible may come to seem possible, even natural, far more natural than that loathsome law of sequence, the law of the regularity of phenomena. We are bored stiff with regularity and sequence. Confess it, you also, you men of science, at the mere thought that, however we may think, we can get no further than the acknowledgment of the old regularity. An invincible disgust to any kind of mental work overcomes us. To discover another law, still another, when already we have far more than we can do with. Surely, if there is any will to think left in us, it is established in the supposition that the mind cannot and must not have any bounds, any limits, and that the theory of knowledge, which is based on the history of knowledge and on a few very doubtful assumptions, is only a piece of property belonging to a certain caste, and has nothing to do with us others. Und die Natur zuletzt sich doch ergründe. What a mad impatience seizes us at times when we realize that we shall never fathom the great mystery. Every individual in the world must have felt at one time the mad desire to unriddle the universe. Even the stodgy philosophers who invented the theory of knowledge have at times made surreptitious sorties, hoping to open a path to the unknown, in spite of their own fat, senseless books that demonstrate the advantages of scientific knowledge. Man either lives in continuous experience, or he frees himself from conclusions imposed by limited experience. All the rest is the devil. From the devil come the blandishments with which Karamzin charmed himself and his readers. Or is it the contrary? Who will answer? Once again, as usual, at the end of a pathetic speech one is left with a conjecture. Let every man please himself. But what about those who would like to live according to Karamzin, but cannot? I cannot speak for them. Schiller recommended hope. Will it do? To be frank, hardly. He who has once lost his peace of mind will never find it again. 17. Ever since Kant succeeded in convincing the learned that the world of phenomena is quite other than the world of true reality, and that even our own existence is not our real existence, but only the visible manifestation of a mysterious unknown substance, philosophy has been stuck in a new rut, and cannot move a single millimetre out of the track laid out by the great Königsbergian. Backward or forward it can go, but necessarily in the Kantian rut. For how can you get out of the counterposing of the phenomenon against the thing in itself? This proposition, this counterposing seems inalterable. So there is nothing left but to stick your head in the heavy draught collar of the theory of knowledge, which most philosophers do, even with a glad smile, which inevitably rouses a suspicion that they have got what they wanted, and their metaphysical need was nothing more than a need for a harness. Otherwise they would have kicked at the sight of the collar. Surely the contraposition between the world of phenomena and the thing in itself is an invention of the reasoning mind, as is the theory of knowledge deduced from this contraposing. Therefore the freedom-loving spirit could reject it in the very beginning, and basta! With the devil one must be very cautious. We know quite well that if he only gets hold of the tip of your ear, he will carry off your whole body. So it is with reason. Grant it one single assumption, admit but one proposition, and finita la commedia, you are in the toils. Metaphysics cannot exist side by side with reason. Everything metaphysical is absurd, everything reasonable is positive. So we come upon a dilemma. The fundamental predicate of metaphysics is absurdity. And yet surely many positive assertions can lay legitimate claim to that self-same, highly respectable predicate. What then? Is there means of distinguishing a metaphysical absurdity from a perfectly ordinary one? May one have recourse to criteria? Will not the very criterion prove a pitfall wherein cunning reason will catch the poor man who was rushing out to freedom? There can be no two answers to this question. All services rendered by reason must be paid for sooner or later at the exorbitant price of self-renunciation. Whether you accept the assistance in the noble form of the theory of knowledge, or merely as a humble criterion, at last you will be driven forth into the streets of positivism. This happens all the time to young, inexperienced minds. They break the bridle and dash forward into space, to find themselves rushing into the same old Rome, whither, as we know, all roads lead. Or, to use more lofty language, rushing into the stable whither also all roads lead. The only way to guard against positivism, granting of course that positivism no longer attracts your sympathies, is to cease to fear any absurdities, whether rational or metaphysical, and systematically to reject all the services of reason. Such behaviour has been known in philosophy, and I make bold to recommend it. Credo quia absurdum comes from the Middle Ages. Modern instances are Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Both present noble examples of indifference to logic and common sense, particularly Schopenhauer, who, a Kantian, even in the name of Kant made such daring sallies against reason, driving her into confusion and shame. That astounding Kantian even went so far, in the master's name still, as to attempt the overthrow of the space and time notions. He admitted clairvoyance, and to this day the learned are bothered whether to class that admission among the metaphysical or the ordinary absurdities. Really, I can't advise them. A very clever man insists on an enormous absurdity, so I am satisfied. Schopenhauer's whole campaign against intellect is very comforting. It is evident that though he set out from the Kantian stable, he soon got sick of hauling along down the cart ruts, and having broken the shafts, he trotted jauntily into a jungle of irreconcilable contradictions, without reflecting in the least where he was making for. The primate of will over reason, and music as the expression of our deepest essence, are not these assertions sufficient to show us how dexterously he wriggled out from the harness of synthetic judgments a priori which Kant had placed upon every thinker? There is indeed much more music than logic in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. Not for nothing is he excluded from the universities. But of course one may speak of him in the open, not of his ideas naturally, but of his music. The European market is glutted with ideas. How neat and nicely finished and logically well turned out those ideas are! Schopenhauer had no such goods. But what lively and splendid contradictions he boldly spreads on his stall, often even without suspicion that he ought to hide them from the police. Schopenhauer cries and laughs and gets furious or glad, without ever realizing that this is forbidden to a philosopher. "Do not speak but sing," said Zarathustra, and Schopenhauer really fulfilled the command in great measure. Philosophy may be music, though it doesn't follow that music may be called philosophy. When a man has done his work, and gives himself up to looking and listening and pleasantly accepting everything, hiding nothing from himself, then he begins to philosophize. What good are abstract formulae to him? Why should he ask himself before he begins to think, what can I think about? What are the limits of thought? He will think, and those who like can do the summing up and the building of theories of knowledge. What is the earthly use of talking about beauty? Beautiful things must be created. Not one single aesthetic theory has so far been able to guess what direction the artist's mind will next take, or what are the limits to his creative activity. The same with the theory of knowledge. It may arrest the work of a man of learning if he be himself afraid that he is going too far, but it is powerless to predetermine human thought. Even Kant's counterposing of things in themselves to the world of phenomena cannot finally clip the wings of human curiosity. There will come a time when this unshakable foundation of positivism will be shaken. All gnosiological disputes as to what thought can or cannot achieve will seem to our posterity just as amusing as the disputes of the schoolmen seem to us. Why did they argue about the nature of truth, when they might have gone out and looked for truth itself, the future historians will ask. Let us have an answer ready for them. Our contemporaries do not want to go out and seek, so they make a great deal of talk about a theory of knowledge. 18. Trust not thyself, young dreamer. However sincerely you may long for truth, whatever sufferings and horrors you may have surpassed, do not believe your own self, young dreamer. What you are looking for you won't find. At the utmost, if you have a gift for writing, you will bring out a nice, original book. Even, do not be offended, you may be satisfied with such a result. In Nietzsche's letters relating to the year 1888, the year when Brandes discovered him, you will find a sad confirmation of the above. Had not Nietzsche struggled, sought, suffered? And behold, towards the end of his life, when it would have seemed that all mundane rewards had become trivial to him, he threw himself with rapture on the tidings of first fame, and rushed to share his joy with all his friends, far and near. He does not tire of telling in dozens of letters and in varying forms the story of how Brandes first began his lectures on him, Nietzsche, how the audience consisted of 300 people, and he even quotes Brandes's placard announcement in the original Danish. Fame just threw him a smile, and forgotten are all the horrible experiences of former days. The loneliness, the desertedness, the cave in the mountain, the man into whose mouth the serpent climbed, all forgotten, every thought turned to the ordinary, easily comprehensible good. Such is man. Mit gieriger Hand nach Schätzen gräbt, und froh ist, wenn Regenwürmer findet. 19. When a man is young, he writes, because it seems to him he has discovered a new, almighty truth which he must make haste to impart to forlorn mankind. Later, becoming more modest, he begins to doubt his truths, and then he writes to convince himself. A few more years go by, and he knows he was mistaken all round, so there is no need to convince himself. Nevertheless, he continues to write, because he is not fit for any other work, and to be accounted a superfluous man is so horrible. 20. A very original man is often a banal writer, and vice versa. We tend so often to write not about what is going on in us, but of our pia desideria. Thus restless, sleepless men sing the glory of sleep and rest, which have long been sung to death. And those who sleep 10 hours on end, and are always up to the mark, must perforce dream about adventures and storms and dangers, and even extol everything problematical. 21. When one reads the books of long dead men, a strange sensation comes over one. These men who lived 200, 300, 3,000 years ago are so far off now from this writing, which they have left on earth. Yet we look for eternal truths in their works. 22. The truth which I have the right to announce so solemnly today, even to the first among men, will probably be a stale old lie on my lips tomorrow. So I will deprive myself of the right of calling such a truth my own. Probably I shall deprive no one but myself. Others will go on loving and praising the selfsame truth, living with it. 23. A writer who cannot lie with inspiration, and that is a great art which few may accomplish, loves to make an exhibition of honesty and frankness. Nothing else is left him to do.